Wonderful. Welcome everyone. We won't start just yet, only because we are waiting just to see if we have a few more still to come in. But in the interim, make sure that you've got your Paneco kit set up that were shipped out to you. I've got my a wonderful box right here. Our partners at Paneco have done a fantastic job putting this together, also in partnership with the Wall Street Journal. My name is Brett Bailey, and I work as the Glenfiddich Regional Brand Ambassador for Southeast Asia. So it's a pleasure for me joining. I can see that we have got a few more coming in. While everyone's actually signing on, getting their video feed sorted out, I'll just go through a little bit of the housekeeping for this evening. As you can see, our moderators have put everyone on mute except for myself. That's wonderful for me because unfortunately, once I start talking, I don't stop. But with that said, if you do have questions going through, I have the wonderful chat option open on the side there. Please feel free to type any questions that you may have going through. Also, I've just had my moderator message me telling me to slow down. I do get very excited during these sessions. So if anyone's having trouble keeping up, by all means, please feel free to put that in the commentary there as well. As mentioned, if you do have questions, it's really important that you put those up on the chat. I will try and answer as many of them as I possibly can as we go through the 3 different expressions this evening. Now, by my watch, we're sitting just around that 7:33 point. So what we might do first off is I've got to quickly unbox what has been sent out to me. As you can see, I've got a little bit of stock behind me here at our Glenfiddich office. But what I wanted to do first is, as mentioned, Paneco put together these amazing kits in collaboration with Glenfiddich. Inside, I'm hoping that everyone has received theirs in due time. What we have, bear with me 2 seconds, is first and foremost, the wonderful Glenfiddich 15-year-old Solera. We'll be going through each of these expressions throughout the course of the evening. After we do the 15, we'll be jumping ahead to the Glenfiddich 18, our small batch reserve cask. And finally, we'll be finishing the evening on number 3, which is the Project 20. Now, a lot of people mispronounce this one as Project XX, totally understandable, but this is a really, really unique product that we'll be going through this evening as well. So what I would recommend is to get your tasting mats sorted out. Feel free, if you want to pour ahead, you're more than welcome to. The important thing for this evening is that everyone gets an opportunity to understand a little bit more about the liquid that you've all purchased. And once again, a big thank you to our partners Paneco, an amazing e-com site that does the highest volume sales at great prices in Singapore for alcohol. And we're in collaboration with the Wall Street Journal this evening as well. So before we jump into the liquid itself, what I want to do is introduce the Glenfiddich distillery just a little bit. Now, behind me, you can see 1887, really important date for us. That's actually when Glenfiddich was founded. We are still a privately owned company. William Grant, our founder, it's now 5th generation ownership. So we haven't ever actually gone public with Glenfiddich. What that means is there's an absolute focus on quality. The family are the only ones that lose out if they put a bad product forward, and it's all about preservation of their namesake. Glenfiddich stands for Valley of the Deer, if it's directly translated from Scottish Gaelic, and we've been distilling continuously since Christmas Day of 1887. So we turned 133 years old at the end of last year, which is quite a milestone date for us. We would be considered one of the legacy Scotch whiskies out there. And we also stand as the world's most awarded single malt, which is quite a nice crown for us to be able to polish up and maintain as we go through our sort of lineage. So Glenfiddich has done a few things that were really critical to pushing the Scotch whiskey industry forward, specifically when it comes to single malt. I won't bore everyone with 133 years of history necessarily, but there's a few key dates that we have to really touch on. So first off is 1963. And this was when Glenfiddich was the very first distillery that ever commercially advertised what a single malt whiskey is. The advert was quite abrasive. It literally had the tagline that said, "Sit when you drink Glenfiddich, you may never stand for blended whiskey again." And so it very much thumbed its nose at the blended whiskey industry and was all about really educating the population on what made single malt whiskey so special. It's the fact that we make at a single unique distillery. It has to be made using only malted barley. Very, very critical that we do that. On top of this, we can only distill in copper pot stills, and it has to be twice distilled. And then finally, it has to spend a minimum of 3 years sitting in oak casks. So that's our maturation process kicking off there. Now, I'm hoping that everyone that's purchased this evening is somewhat familiar with whiskey. The production itself, if anyone has questions regarding what it takes to actually create the liquid, by all means, throw anything that's very, very specific in the question box on the chat. Absolutely no issue jumping into this. But going back to our dates, which is a nice little segue for us to get started on actually consuming some whiskey, which is kind of the big premise for this evening, is 1998. So it sounds like a very big jump. It's only 22 years ago. And that's when the 15-year-old Solera was actually first put out to market. Now, this is an important date for us because this goes back to our former malt master, a gentleman named Mr. Dave Stewart, who is actually a member of the British Empire. He's the first person within the Scotch whiskey industry that has actually been given that title of recognition for his contribution to the British Empire. Scotch whiskey is obviously quite a large component of the British GDP, and so therefore he got a pretty special award and is one of the leaders when it comes to the single malt industry and also the Scotch whiskey industry in general. So in 1998, Dave, been with us for a few years at that point, decided that he'd take himself on vacation, went down to the Spanish coast, got himself a nice suntan, and while he was there, figured that because we do use a lot of sherry casks when it comes to producing whiskey, he should probably go and have a look at what it's like in a sherry bodega. And so one of the things that really caught his eye was the concept of a Solera system. Now, the easiest way for me to sort of describe what a Solera is generational batch blending, which sounds a little bit vague to start off, but we'll get through that as we do a tasting of the Glenfiddich 15. So Dave went down and saw this process, thought, you know what, there's something incredible here, and I think we can deploy a format, while not necessarily replicating the exact process, we can take inspiration from that and create a Scotch whiskey Solera system. And so that's what he did. He went back to Scotland, up to the distillery in Speyside, and immediately commissioned a 37,000 litre marrying tun, giant wooden vessel. And in that, he then blended 3 different cask types of minimum age 15-year Scotch whiskey. All of this sat for about 4 months. After that 4-month period, he only drew half of that vat down and sent that out for bottling. So he still had half sitting in. This is where they actually put the next round of 15-year-old whiskey in there. Again, let it sit for 4 months. And from there, the process began. So we've now been doing this continuously for 22 years, which means roughly around 66 generations of 15-year-old whiskey has produced through this process. So with that said, I can already feel myself getting thirsty. I got prepared and poured myself a cheeky little dram of the Glenfiddich 15. Now, you will notice my glass has a little stem on it because it was a little bit more convenient for me to hold, but you would have been handed in your packages from Paneco, the little tasting glasses from Glenfiddich. So before we jump into this, one thing that's really, really important for us to remember is that we're not tasting wine. If anyone's done wine tastings before, you know it's big swirls and big gasps of air through your nose. If anyone does that at home, I do apologize for not telling you beforehand. Usually it ends in tears. We have a much higher alcohol concentration when it comes to single malt whiskey. What I would recommend is once you've poured your dram, you can put your nose in for sure, but it's not a deep breath. I would recommend breathing through your mouth rather than actually trying to sniff the whiskey. The reason behind that is that it's going to soften the impact by adding air. It sounds like a weird technique, but it's definitely worth trying. And on top of that, it makes you look like you know what you're doing. So if you want to take your Glenfiddich 15, first and foremost, we have to raise one up, say Slunjavar or cheers in Scottish Gaelic. But I do recommend have a nose. This is a whiskey that I am very, very familiar with. Quite a few sessions hosted, this tends to be the crowd favorite in a lot of ways. And I think it comes down to the fact that we've got amazing complexity coming through for an absolute bargain price. Keeping in mind that we've got all these generations of whiskey that have processed through that Solera vat, one thing that's going to do is really build out the consistency of this product. I've been fortunate enough that I've actually tried one of the bottlings from 1998, side by side with the recent updated bottling. Flavor profile was exactly on point. The only thing that had changed was because that bottle had been open for a few years, alcohol had dissipated very slightly. So give it a little swirl, have a bit of a nose, and hopefully the first thing you'll notice from a Glenfiddich whiskey when you do take it onto the palate is we've always got a relatively sweet, fruit-driven style. Now, this is a bit of a unique one given the fact that because we do have an amplification of our sherry cask going into this, we're going to have a little bit more of a spicy note that really drives behind that. As I mentioned before, we put 3 different cask styles in. The first and the majority of that liquid is actually former bourbon cask. Now, this is where we tend to develop more mild flavors, a lot of sweetness, hints of vanilla coming through quite strong, but it's not going to be overly complex and it's not going to be very robust. But this is something that we want. It allows us to manipulate the whiskey by adding in sherry cask, which is big, bold, spicy flavors, a lot of red fruits, honey sweetness comes in. It's usually a very rich, semi-tannic flavor. So we do get little hints of bitterness coming in there as well. And then finally, a very small amount of our whiskey actually engages a secondary technique that Dave Stewart is also known for creating, and that's the concept of finishing. So we take a very small percentage of that American cask whiskey that's matured for 15 years, and at the very end of that 15-year maturation, we'll actually transfer for 6 months into what's called a virgin cask. Now, this is a brand new, never filled American oak cask that we heavily char on the inside. What that does is kind of develop a bridging point between our very subtle, very sweet vanilla-driven American oak or bourbon cask, and then our spicy, heavy, very, very tannic, very flavorsome Spanish cask or sherry cask as it is. That bridging point sits perfectly in there, and it creates a really robust whiskey. Slanjavar. One thing that I love about this particular whiskey is the fact that it's not just flavors that we'll taste, we'll also get the opportunity to actually feel those flavors. And you have to bear with me because I know that sounds a little bit cheesy that we've got feelings involved now. But what I'm talking about is that spiciness that we get from the sherry really hits the very tip of your tongue. If this is your first sip of the evening, more often than not, people will describe this to me as if they've just bitten into fresh ginger or they're sucking on a cinnamon quill. And it's that kind of bites you back sort of feeling that comes through. It's very brief, it's quite warm, very, very warming kind of sensation comes over your tongue. And then as it washes back, it kind of rounds out into this viscous sort of honey flavor. A lot of kind of dusty chocolate notes come through. Big, bold spice still hangs around. And we've also got dried muscatels, raisins, cherries, very kind of red fruit flavors that come in there. Once you've actually taken that sip down, one thing that you might notice is a very warming sensation right here in the middle of your chest. Now, this is where the conversation over higher alcohol creates that chest burn. It's actually a fallacy. All the whiskeys that we're going to be tasting tonight sit at what we would classify as bottle strength. So that's 40% minus the Project 20, which we'll get to that one in a second. But that warmth is, again, revisiting that 15-year-old spice that's coming from the sherry cask. The sweetness is definitely there from that American bourbon cask. I'm not sure if anyone picks up, but there's also a very, very subtle hint of campfire or bonfire smoke. And that's what the virgin cask really develops, but it's more of that bridging platform between. I've seen one review come through already. Very nice, great way to describe it. This is a workhorse whiskey for me. When I do have the opportunity to travel, unlike we all sort of are stuck at the moment, this is the one that really speaks volumes to a lot of people because there is a lot more going on in this than if anyone's ever tried our Glenfiddich 12. It is such a value for money whiskey. It is something that you should be able to find in most bars around the world. And it's something that is so reliable, genuinely from a standpoint of quality and quantity. It's readily available. You don't have to pay a fortune for it. And once again, you've just got this amazing amount of flavor that really, really drives itself through. Well received, top seller on Paneco platform. That's what I like to see. As mentioned, we have partnered with Paneco this evening. I'm just going to make mention of the fact that we do have a coupon that will be available should anyone decide that they need to top up after the end of this session. So the coupon, I believe, will be posted by our moderators into the group chat. It's just a coupon code, which is Glen15 with a capital G. What that will entitle you to is $15 off any order above $200, and that will be valid through until September 15th. So definitely, if you enjoy this evening's products, make sure you jump on there, top up the home bar. Sadly, while phase 2 is in effect here in Singapore, we've still got a little ways to go, and why not share a dram at home with a friend? Now, we've gone through 15. We will have a bit of a discussion this evening about age statements, because there is a bit of a fallacy again when it comes to whiskey. There's a lot of mysticism, a lot of theory that it has to be, conversation of politics while swilling a dram of whiskey and smoking a cigar in a big leather chair. Doesn't have to be the case at all. Once we get to the Project 20, we'll really enter that kind of nouveau whiskey category where we're seeing these really incredible experiments come through that don't actually have age statements. So there's a lot for us to unpack on that particular whiskey. But before we do, we have to jump up 3 years. And so we are going to go into the Glenfiddich 18. Just seen Benny put up great flavor profile, couldn't agree more. And just a reminder, if anyone does have questions, be it about Solera, how we mature a whiskey, or how we actually produce, we've got plenty of time. If you do want to know anything in particular, throw it in the group chat and we can have a bit of a discussion about that as we go through. So, as prepared earlier, Glenfiddich 18. Now, this is going to be an interesting one because quite often people expect older to be better. Not necessarily the case. It really comes down to the application and who and how and where you're going to share your whiskey. So 18 years, quite a lengthy period, but when it comes to Scotch whiskey, we're still sort of talking about the entry segments of aging. As you can see behind me, we've got Glenfiddich 30. We go actually as high up of whiskeys that I know that hang out in the distillery. There is an 83-year-old cask that's floating around behind closed doors. Sadly, for some reason, I wasn't allowed to take a bottle of that home, so I can't pass anyone taste testers, but I'll see how I go the next time I get up there. So what we have in this, Glenfiddich 18. Once again, very, very unique product when it comes to our portfolio, because this is what we would classify as a small batch whiskey. Something that's a little sort of unique for us, especially with the perspective that people do hold when it comes to Glenfiddich. We are actually the world's highest selling single malt Scotch whiskey. So our 12-year-old does more volume than any other single malt whiskey from Scotland on the planet. On top of that, we actually hold the title for the single malt category in general. So we've only lost that 1 year in the last sort of 20, which means that we're doing something correct as we go through. So when we say small batch, this is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot, especially in the whiskey world, often in the rum worlds as well. But this really does speak true to a small batch when it comes to our production capacities at Glenfiddich. So what that means, every single bottle, and in fact, you can check this to see if I'm just telling you stories. On all of the bottles at home, you'll be able to identify, and in fact, I'm going to grab mine out. You'll be able to identify on the very bottom labeling, this little white ribbon label. On the right-hand side, there's a handwritten number in blue pen. I'm not sure why it's always in blue, but it is. And what that is actually telling us is the exact batch that this whiskey has come from. So in theory, if anyone was really, really desperate to know, we can actually contact the distillery, quote the batch number, they go through the ledger, and what they'll be able to tell us from that is the number of bottles produced, the cask strength that actually exited from the barrels at, what the cask ratio was, how much of that American bourbon cask did we use, how much of that sherry cask did we use when we were doing our blending process. All of those nitty-gritty details that we don't get just from seeing a number on the bottle is actually encapsulated within the ledgers back at the distillery. This is a really useful tool because there's one secret weapon that we have hiding away at the distillery, and it's a gentleman known as Brian Kinsman. So Brian is the modern day version of Dave Stewart, who created the 15. He actually followed up behind Dave, did an apprenticeship under Dave Stewart, which took 10 years. Brian already had a PhD in chemistry and was actively working at the distillery, but it took 10 years for him not to learn the science and recipes of producing whiskey, but really the art, because the malt master is definitely the artist, while we have craftsmen that build casks, stills, harvest barley, as it is. So he's the guy who has to be able to nose and tell exactly what point of a maturation process any whiskey is at. I had the fortunate opportunity of sharing a couple drinks with Brian when I was in Cognac last year on a work trip, and I wanted to test this theory out. And so I was with all of our other brand ambassadors from around the world. I put it to our global ambassador, Struan, is Brian worth the hype that everyone says? And his response to me was pretty blank-faced. He just said, try him. So myself and 4 of the other ambassadors who had just started on with the company, we actually approached the bar in the hotel that we're in, and we ordered blind whiskeys that Brian had no way of actually seeing what we were ordering. So just to paint the picture for where we were at during this period, we'd done 3 cognac distillery tastings already throughout the day. Brian had then run us through 8 cask strength red wine finished Glenfiddichs that are unreleased. We then had a big dinner, wine. We're out on the terrace smoking cigars and enjoying some more cask strength whiskey. And sure enough, we approached him and started putting random glasses down. Now I was expecting Brian to be able to give us a rough kind of range, a rough gauge. He picked up the first glass, nosed it, and immediately labeled the distillery and also the age statement. And it was from nowhere near Glenfiddich. So that blew me away to start off with. The next one was he actually picked up a glass, looked at it, and went, oh, that's Glenfiddich 18, and put it back down again. Just from having it this close to his nose, even with all the chaos that was going around him, he could actually get the nose from this, which is really, really important, because his nose is entirely responsible for building out the cask ratio and essentially the recipe that makes up Glenfiddich 18. I had a chat with Brian over a Skype call a few weeks back and wanted to clarify with him a few of the numbers. So his rough ratio when it comes to Glenfiddich 18 is going to be about 85% ex-bourbon cask, usually from refill. So what this means, we've bought it from the bourbon industry, we've brought it up to Scotland, we filled it up with whiskey. That is technically classified as a refill cask. So 15% that's left over comes from sherry cask. And what that does is make it just a little bit more robust and brings in that kind of flavor profile that we're looking for and develops that depth. So if you care to join me, with the Glenfiddich 18, we will notice that this is a lot more subtle than what we see in the Glenfiddich 15. We don't get that big smacking spice note that you get to start off with the Glenfiddich 15. But keeping in mind, because we've eliminated that virgin cask that goes into the Solera, it means that we've bolstered the bourbon cask. And so that sort of more subtle vanilla flavor will be something that's more imparted. So have a nose. Hopefully, the first thing that you'll start to get is that kind of sweet, creamy kind of nose coming through, which sounds like a weird one for us to try and isolate on the nose, but hopefully it translates when we actually get to taking a sip. One of the other things with this, our distillery character, or what the new make spirit or unaged whiskey comes off of our stills tasting like, is very much a fresh apple and pear kind of flavor. So that fruit-driven nature that comes naturally from the distillery occurs during our fermentation process. That's relatively apparent in this particular whiskey, but it's not quite as fresh. What we're looking at is more along the lines of if we took apples and pears, put them inside of the oven and cooked them down for a little while. So really sort of enrich the flavor profile that was trapped within the fruit. Instead of vanilla on this, I definitely sort of see a more matured version of that. There's a little bit of salinity that comes in here. And for me, that really develops into a salted caramel kind of flavor. And because, again, I am quite familiar with this particular whiskey for some reason, I know for a fact that we've got a significant amount of oak that comes through on the profile. So if you haven't already, feel free to imbibe. Now, there is a term that always gets thrown out when I'm doing these tastings live. A little bit difficult when it comes to having everyone on mute in front of me, but that's totally fine. if there was something, in fact, I can already see it has popped up at some point, but I think that was referring to the 15. There's a term that I never use when I'm actually hosting a training, because when it comes to the 18-year-old, inevitably, someone's going to say it. So I like to describe this as incredibly easy drinking, and it's very linear. Now, linear sounds like I'm saying it's boring, which is not the case at all. Saying that it enters and exits at the exact same pace. So we get this beautiful wash over our palate. All that rich sweetness comes in. You got those wonderful fruit notes. All of a sudden, salted caramel flavors are in there, and then this really, really extended 18-year-old oak flavor, which develops quite nicely. While there's a lot of oak that comes into the 15, the extension of this makes it to a point where you don't really notice that it dissipates from your palate. So it doesn't have a hard cutoff point like some of the other whiskeys coming out of Speyside, which makes it quite pleasant. I have to be very cautious when I'm drinking the 18, mostly because it goes down very, very easily. The 15-year-old for me really reminds you of the fact that you've got a whiskey in your glass and you're not sort of hurrying yourself through. This is definitely a moment whiskey. It's not something I would share most of the time with my mates around the world, unless they're real whiskey heads. Mostly because of the fact that I don't think they'd understand it too much. And more importantly, unless they're buying it for me, that's on them. With that said, what I like to always put out as we sort of go through this is a bit of a gauge. Who enjoyed the 15-year-old more and who enjoyed the 18-year-old more just currently? Once again, I said we'd get into the conversation regarding age being important and how there's a real mentality in the Scotch whiskey industry about age making something better. It's not really the case. I was doing a session up in Vietnam one night, hosting a dinner. I had everything from the 12 up to the 21. And one of the things that was really important was to identify this process. So I asked the question to the group, out of the 4 whiskeys on the table, which is the best whiskey? And immediately you could hear the shuddering of jackets. Everyone pointed at the 21 because it was the oldest. We hadn't tried any of them as of yet. So it was this image that was already burned in their heads. I looked at this and said, okay, let me rephrase the question. I'm having a quiet night at home. I'm with someone who doesn't necessarily understand a lot about whiskey. What is going to be my go-to whiskey if I was going to serve a highball? In that instance, my suggestion was always going to be the 12-year-old was the best whiskey for that application. I think that's the really important thing for us to remember is what is the purpose you're drinking it for and how are you actually going to serve it? 15-year-old for me, more than likely, I'm not going to be adding any water to kind of dilute or cut that down. And the reason is I really enjoy the flavor. I like that spice sensation that comes through, that warming of the chest. And again, it's reminding me that I'm drinking a whiskey. With the 18, I don't mind this at bottle strength. That said though, a couple drops of water really help to open up the bouquet on the nose and also just takes a little bit more of that extension and draws it out even further. So if you haven't ever tried cutting a whiskey at home, I highly recommend it, especially with the one that we've got coming up next. And the reason behind that is that the Project 20 actually sits well above our bottling strength, and that sits at a non-chill filtered 47% ABV. So we do have a bit of a jump when it comes to this. So if anyone needs to take a moment to grab just a small glass of water, if you've got straws or pipettes or any fun instruments at home, by all means, feel free to jump off, grab something very quickly. But if you're also happy to consume at the bottling strength of 47%, that's totally fine. That's how I actually prefer this whiskey as well. So jumping on to the Project 20. Now, this is a whiskey that within the Glenfiddich brand ambassador, I guess, pseudo-cult, or rather the bigger group of us, this one is a really special point within, I guess, the culture of our industry. And the reason is, this was launched as the second experiment within our experimental series. The first was actually an IPA cask finish that came out the same year. This is going back to 2016. And what we saw with this was the culmination of 20 minds selecting 20 casks, and then it came down to Brian Kinsman to actually create a blend using these casks that they'd selected. You may have noticed that we've got Project 20 on there. It doesn't actually mean that this is a 20-year-old whiskey. This is what we would classify as a no-age statement. These have a bit of a bad name. There's a bit of a bad reputation that has been cemented in people's minds, which is why when we had the opportunity to work with Paneco this evening, I really wanted to put this on the stage and really put it out there, because this whiskey is incredible. Yes, it doesn't have an age statement telling us how young the whiskey could be. For anyone who didn't know this, the age statement on any spirit bottle, so 18, 15, 21, 50, whatever that age statement is actually indicating the youngest whiskey that has gone in that bottle. And so if you put 1 teaspoon of 12-year-old whiskey into a 50-year-old cask, by law and by legalities, that is all now classified as 12-year-old whiskey, which is why we don't put too much of the 50-year-old in any of our 12-year-old bottles. So this was a selection made up by the brand ambassadors. So we had 19 during that year that actually went over to Scotland. They did a week-long tasting of about 100 to 120 single cask whiskies, immense notes, all this time spent with Brian Kinsman, who was the 20th man on the team. And at the end of it, they went through and each one of them selected which whiskey was their favorite. As soon as that whiskey was taken, no one else could choose that cask anymore. So I know for a fact that there's whiskey in this from a 1984 hogshead, which is quite an incredible one. I've had the fortunate opportunity to actually sample that on its own, which was very, very gentle, but the flavor was immense. I also know that we've got a port pipe. In total, to round this out, we've got 17 different casks that are all using American oak in the format of either a bourbon cask or a hogshead, which is essentially a Frankenstein grown out version of a bourbon cask. We've then got 2 sherry butts or sherry casks. And finally, our former Canadian ambassador, Beth Havers, she actually selected a port pipe. So 500 liters, big, big, robust flavors coming in there as well. Very interesting. There's a lot that goes on within this whiskey. As mentioned, just be aware of the fact that we do have that higher ABV. So when you do nose this, you might get a little bit more of a kick. It's actually not overly offensive in my opinion. Some people are a little bit more sensitive to the alcohol vapor that's coming off. If that's the case, one trick that I learned from a tour guide up at Glenfiddich, just gently blow into your glass, not hard enough that it's going to spray you in the face, because that's going to be a bad time for everyone. But it's just to try and alleviate some of the fumes that have accumulated within your glass since pouring. Other than that, same trick as before. Put your nose in, have a bit of a smell, open your mouth and breathe through that just to take the edge off. Now, one trick that I've always used, even before I actually started with Glenfiddich, was I quite often think about whiskeys in color. Again, you're going to have to bear with me on this, but it makes sense with a whiskey like this. For me, I would describe this as pink whiskey on the nose and then yellow on the palate. So if you put it up to your nose and have a bit of the smell, think about quite a vibrant pink color. The one thing that really comes through to me from that is that kind of confectionery, Brian describes it as cotton candy, but it's a really sweet sort of sugary note that comes off. Really, really tasty on the nose. It's quite an overwhelming smell. We don't get a lot of other sort of elements coming in, but that confectionery sets us up for something that's a little bit unexpected. So if you're game enough at the bottle strength of 47%, have a little bit of a sip, try and wash it around in your mouth before you sort of put it down. What it really develops into, once it actually hits my palate, is that yellow flavor. So what it sort of describes for me is sort of like a buttered, salted popcorn. Those kind of notes really come through. It does follow through with nice oak coming in there as well. A little bit of fire from that ABV being cranked up a little bit there. And then finally on the back palate, so that breath out, quite often I'll try and breathe out through my nose after taking a sip, mostly because we've got a significant amount of taste receptors up in our nasal capacities. Our tongue, a little bit more dulled out, especially because of the fact that we've had a few sips of whiskey already. So that breath back out is always going to bring that kind of pink nosing flavor of that sort of confectionery sugar. Quite often I'll describe this almost like the flavors of going to the carnival when I was a child. Probably not the ideal way to describe it, but that's the memory that kind of comes jogging back for me from sipping this particular whiskey. Now, if anyone decided that they wanted to try this by cutting as well, now would be the time if you haven't already. I would go very controlled in doing so. And what you will hopefully see is if the water that you're using is slightly chilled, we'll get an effect called lushing. Now, lushing is where your whiskey will actually go a cloudy color. And this is because we haven't put this particular liquid through a process called chill filtration. It's exactly what it sounds like. We actually drop the temperature of the whiskey when it comes out of the cask down to about 0 to maybe -4 degrees if we really push it, and then we put it through a filter. What we're trying to do there is take out fatty acids. There's very, very minute ester loss, which this is where a lot of people start to argue about the benefits and cons of doing chill filtration. Are we stripping flavor off? Or is the commercial value of this better? All it really does is prevents this lushing process from happening. So being that this sits above 46%, which is the point where we start to see that happen, at room temperature, we'll be fine. As soon as you cut that down with water, because it hasn't had these elements taken out, you will notice that the liquid goes a little, very sort of cloudy kind of hue to it, almost as if it's getting milky. If anyone drinks absinthe and has seen this happen before, where your crystal clear glass of bright green liquid suddenly goes into a milky, murky kind of color, it's the exact same thing happening. It's all of those fatty acids, not necessarily congealing, but they just hit the point where you can begin to see them in the liquid. Absolutely nothing wrong with your whiskey. All it means is that there's been a reaction due to the temperature, and that's all it is. For myself, I do enjoy this at the bottle strength. I think one of the things that Brian said to me that was really important, and quite often I get asked, what's the best way to drink whiskey? The simple answer is however you like. I was in Malaysia, I won't say the gentleman's name, but I had the fortunate opportunity sitting in a whiskey bar that I met a chap who was friends with the owner. And I noticed that he was drinking a 30-year-old blended whiskey and was mixing it with Mountain Dew. And I was quite new to Glenfiddich, but I'd worked in the industry long enough to know that you can ask someone why they're drinking that way, but you should never ask them, what's the point? Everyone can enjoy whiskey however they want. So I'm watching him mix 30-year-old whiskey, about $1,000 a bottle, with Mountain Dew, stirring it down and quite happily sitting there and drinking it. So I had to approach him and say, look, I've never seen this in my life. And he said, it's the Mountain Dew, isn't it? I said, absolutely. Just curious, I work in the industry. What's the point here? So that was when he educated me about Mountain Dew being created initially as a chaser for whiskey before it got as refined as it is now. It was a real lesson in just remembering anyone can drink it however they want. Once you purchase, that's entirely yours to do as you please. And I think it's really important to find the way that you enjoy it. So being in Singapore, temperature's quite warm. Most of the time, it's been a little chilly the last few weeks, but if you prefer ice in your whiskey, by all means, put it in there. What I would recommend is trying to understand what that does to impact the actual liquid. So when we talk about adding water to cut your liquid, what we're kind of doing is adding molecules to stretch flavor. So it's dilution of alcohol in theory, but by adding volume. So we're not actually losing any of the booze in our glass. It's just stretching that liquid out. Once you put ice into whiskey, what will happen is if you think of yourself jumping off a flight in the middle of winter in Scotland, your body's going to make you sort of shut down a little bit. You're coming the other way, winter down here in Singapore, as soon as you get off that flight, you want nothing to touch any part of yourself. Your body really wants to expand. And the exact same thing is what happens with your liquid in the glass. When you put colder temperature in, all those molecules will begin to shut down, sort of clump up on one another, and you lose the ability to actually taste. Ice is a funny one because we're also diluting at the same point. So it's a bit of a weird one where it hits a perfect point of having that right temperature, right dilution, and very quickly we lose that. That said, if you like putting Coke in your whiskey, I'm not here to stop you, but I would always recommend trying it at whatever the distiller has released that particular whiskey at, more to understand what they're thinking of when they're trying to put this out as a statement that speaks about who they are as a master blender, a malt master, a distiller. There's a lot of people that work in the industry and they're incredibly proud of what they do. So Glenfiddich is, as I said, a legacy brand. Being that we are family owned, the entire operation runs as one big family. I've been fortunate enough that I've met the Coopers, I've met some of our coppersmiths, including Dennis McBain. He's been with us for 62 years now and is the most sprightly 82-year-old I've ever met in my life. But hearing the stories direct from them makes you really appreciate what goes into producing each of these whiskeys. The Project 20 that we just had has actually got whiskey in there that's significantly older than I am, which makes me feel quite privileged for the fact that we get to enjoy these moments sharing a dram or two going through. Now, I have to ask the question again. When it comes to the three expressions that have come up, I've seen 15 versus 18, tough one. I personally prefer 15 for its boldness, and I agree entirely. Project 20, really good. Anyone having it for the first time, that's a great question. If this is your first time trying something from our experimental range, there's a whole lot to unpack there because we actually had 4 expressions come out within that series. How would you say the 12 and 21 are in relation to this? Great question, and clearly someone quite familiar with the brand. So Glenfiddich 12 is definitely what we would classify as our entry-level single malt Scotch whiskey. I would actually recommend that to someone before trying a no-age statement like the Project 20 or the IPA, because it's a very, very easy to understand, great way to enter into a very, very complex category of spirits. The 12-year-old, going back to my color theory, Glenfiddich 12 is very much a green whiskey for me. So it's fresh, vibrant fruit flavors of apple and pear, or as the distillery describes, orchard fruits. I get grassy notes coming through on it, a lot of heavy, sweet vanilla flavor, and very, very subtle oak. Very quick whiskey. So for me, it's about a 7-second experience from the time that you actually swallow it down to embrace that flavor, and then it very quickly runs away. Rather than comparing that to the 21, I would sort of describe it as the younger brother of the 18 because the two are actually linked. So the flavor profile on both of them is quite similar. The easiest way for me to say is that the 12-year-old is kind of like the 12-year-old nephew, runs around the table at family dinner once, makes a whole bunch of noise and then runs out the room. Everyone goes, wow, that was sweet. 18-year-old swaggers in the room, wants to sit down, engage in the conversation a little bit more, and then very gradually kind of vacates the room. We go to the 21. That is a rum cask finish, a lot more complex. For me, it's the perfect trifecta if anyone's a cigar smoker, because we have Caribbean rum cask influence, so big, strong molasses and vanilla flavors. We have some very unique kind of tropical fruits, but the one that jumps out for me the most is absolutely banana. Brian will describe it as guavas, but it's been quite a while since I've just sat there snacking on guavas. The banana for me speaks very true to the fact that it's 100% bourbon cask. And then finally, we get that sort of slightly drier Scotch whiskey element to it. Scotch whiskey is not always a dry component, especially with the expressions that we've just tried. But in comparison to a bourbon or a rum, I would absolutely describe that as having a much more dry sort of finish to it. First time trying the Project 20, not as smooth as the 15 or 18. That's interesting. This is where I would definitely recommend, if that was the experience, I would probably try cutting that down with some drops of water. End of the day, you've got a full bottle there for you to experiment and play around with. So hopefully you can find that sweet point. If you do have a pipette at home, it's a great way to do it. If not, what you can always do is take a rocks glass and you can put your pinky in. You want to make sure you've washed your hands before doing this. If you've got anything greasy or anything on your hands prior to, it is going to disrupt any flavor profile within your whiskey. So that's sort of the very cowboy last-ditch effort to try and get those drops in on a very controlled base. Still in love with the 21. I can understand that entirely. It's a beautiful drop. Unfortunately, tonight was not the night for us to touch on that one, but if anyone hasn't tried it, that's a great way for you to spend that $200 to hit that $15 discount. So just to remind everyone there, including our moderators, to make sure that we see this go in, is there is a coupon code that you can all use on Paneco, which is $15 off a $200 order or more. So if you are looking to try and get into the Glenfiddich world a little bit more, you want to try that 21, that's a great avenue for you to do it. As you can see in the chat there, the code is GLEN15 with a capital G, and that's going to be something you can avail of up until September 15th. So you've got about 2.5 weeks to jump on board with that one. Now, is there any other questions regarding Glenfiddich? I've seen the distillery edition of the 15 is definitely the favorite. I like that as well. That's sitting a lot higher, though, from memory in, in the ABV. Have noticed a few no-age cask strengths in the duty-free. Are those really mass market basis? This is a great question. So we have multiple segments of how the business operates. Duty-free is something that avails of a lot of unique opportunities. So it's something that we see releases that you won't get in domestic market. Sometimes, for example, in Hong Kong, there was a specific single cask release of a 40-year-old that was only available at Hong Kong airport. But with that said, that's actually beyond my role with the company. It's not a category that I touch on too often. You may notice that there's some amazing products that do come through from time to time, but sadly, they're not part of domestic market. If you are looking for unique expressions, as always, highly recommend jump on Paneco. That offer's there with the coupon code at the moment, so make the most of that as you go through. With that said, that is our touch points for the Glenfiddich. One last time, just to see, was anyone's favorite the 15 still at the end of that? Was it the 18 at the end, or was it the Project 20? For myself, it's kind of like picking children. The 15 is my reliable, trusty, always there for me. Giselle is saying that it's 18. Thanks for 18, still one of the favorites. Perfect. Project 20, love seeing that we've got that. If you enjoyed the Project 20, what I would definitely suggest is to try and see if you can find the IPA cask finish, which is a really beautiful statement. Also no age, but finished in an IPA cask. So it brings in hoppy, semi-bitter notes, a lot of citrus, a lot of floral flavors coming in there. On top of that, we did a release that's incredibly difficult to find now, which is the Winter Storm. And sadly, it hasn't reached Southeast Asia yet, but there is a fourth expression, which is a peated whiskey that is finished in a rum cask. So quite an interesting one there. 18, 20, 15, that sequence, perfect. I like that we've got, as we go along, story behind the Project 20. That's my favorite part. And in fact, one thing I forgot to mention is that the gentleman that I actually have replaced here at Glenfiddich just over 18 months ago, still resides here. His name is Matthew Ferguson Stewart. If anyone's been to any whiskey tastings around, you may have met him before. He's actually one of the people that had the opportunity to select a cask during his tenure with Glenfiddich, based here in Singapore. So Singapore actually has a bit of an attachment to that one, which is quite nice. Really brings it home for us. What's my favorite whiskey? More often than not, it's the one that's closest to me. I think as long as I've got good company, a whiskey can always be enjoyed. But out of the three that are on the table here, realistically, it comes down to value for money. And we don't necessarily have a favorite right now. I do consume a lot of the 15, just because I think it's very, very consistent in its process. Sorry, will we share the recording of this session? That we can definitely do. I've just been given the A-OK from the moderator. And perfect, there we go. Moderators jumped in right on time. If anyone doesn't have any more questions currently, not necessarily here to try and promote my social media. However, it's more if you do have a question that jumps to you at the very end, please feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. It's probably the easiest way. I don't really check my Facebook anymore, mostly because it's inundated with a lot of messages from my previous life over in the Philippines. Thank you again to Paneco and the Wall Street Journal for joining us with this session. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this. Please take advantage of that $15 coupon. As mentioned, that will be available up until September 15th. Hope everyone had a great night. Enjoy your evenings. Thank you very much.